Bermuda is a chain of 138 coral islands, shaped like a giant fishhook, covering 21.5 square miles of bays and hills, rising to just 249 feet. Some 10,000 years ago, it was 200 miles long. It lies isolated in the North Atlantic, 700 miles southeast of North Carolina, and around 800 miles north of the Bahamas. However, the warm Gulf Stream gives Bermuda a subtropical climate. In the 17th century, it was surveyed and divided, as shown in this map, into 8 tribes, which subsequently became the 9 parishes, east to west, of St. George's, Hamilton, Paget, Smiths, Devonshire, the extra one of Pembroke up here, which is where the town of Hamilton now is, Warwick, Southampton, and Somerset. As you can tell, it was eventually settled by the British, as we know. However, the first recorded discovery of Bermuda was made by the Spanish seafarer Juan de Bermudez in 1505, only 13 years after Columbus discovered America. In Peter Martyr's Atlas in 1511, La Bermuda is shown for the first time. The Spaniards and their treasure fleets found that just north of Bermuda, the easterly current bent towards Europe, helping them to sail home. By the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, Bermuda was called Devil's Island because its coral reefs had wrecked so many ships, but mainly because of the masses of screeching birds which spooked passing sailors at night time. After Henry May was wrecked here in 1593, his account was the first about the islands. That and what happened next would inspire Shakespeare's play, The Tempest. In 1609, a fleet of 7 tall ships and 2 smaller pinnaces set out from Plymouth with food and other supplies to relieve Jamestown in Virginia, England's first settlement in America. They also had more colonists aboard. The admiral of the fleet, Sir George Somers, shown here, had begun his seafaring career as a buccaneer, really a pirate, acquiring his wealth and knighthood from capturing Spanish prize ships. The Virginia Company had put him in command of the Jamestown Relief Fleet, and his new 300-ton flagship, the Sea Venture, was its largest ship. After 7 weeks at sea, a terrible storm, almost certainly a hurricane, caused the Sea Venture to lose sight of the rest of the fleet. The winds howled for 3 days, and the ship was leaking heavily and near sinking. Everyone worked the pumps and bailed the ship, including Admiral Somers, but the caulking had gone and the water was coming in too fast. The crew and passengers gave up, commended themselves to God, and opened the brandy. Then land was sighted. The storm had ended. On the morning of the 28th of July, 1609, the ship stuck fast on a coral reef, but all 150 men, women, and children, and the ship's dog, were rowed to shore and realized that they were on the dreaded islands of Bermuda. It was therefore a surprise to find they were lovely islands, with herds of wild pigs, no doubt from wrecked ships, cedar trees, nourishing plants, and a delightful climate. In addition to fishing and hunting the wild hogs, they found delicious cahal birds, a kind of tern named for their calls. This is the cahal bird here, which became an endangered species, and because it was so nice to eat. This is the bay grape tree, which is indigenous to Bermuda, and also the Bermuda cedar tree. A lot of them were cut down, but they're now being regrown again. The passengers and crew were set to making shelters, finding food, mapping the islands, and building 2 ships from the cedar trees and the wreck of the Sea Venture. These were the Deliverance and the Patience. This is a replica of the Deliverance, which sits now in St. George Harbour, seen from 2 different angles. It took them 9 months to build the ships before they could finally sail on. Here they found the colony reduced to 60 people by famine and raids by native tribes. Without the relief voyage to Jamestown, the English colony in America would not have survived. You can see Jamestown here on an old map, up the river, the James River. And Roanoke down here, where there were other settlers later. The colonists wanted to leave, but by lucky coincidence, another relief fleet arrived under Lord de la Ware. This was 8 years before the Pilgrim Fathers landed in the Mayflower at Plymouth Rock. The two ships returned to Bermuda for more supplies, but Somers died there in November 1610. His nephew, now in charge, instead of taking supplies back to Jamestown, hurriedly put Sir George's body into a barrel of brandy and sailed for England to claim his inheritance. The other cruise stories led the Virginia Company to obtain the grant of the Bermudas from King James I, and in 1612 they sent out 60 people to form the first permanent settlers, the ship's carpenter Richard Moore as governor. Moore ordered the colonists to build wharves for shipping and forts for defence against possible Spanish raids. Here we see the castle fort. The Spanish weren't happy about the English being in Bermuda, as the Pope had divided up the world outside Europe between Spain and Portugal. So the English in Jamestown had guns pointing down the river, and Bermuda built more forts to protect themselves. Here's another fort and a cannon that is at one of the other forts. This is Fort St. Catherine here. When two Spanish ships were sighted, the men on watch panicked, knocked over a barrel of gunpowder, and fired 2 cannonballs, narrowly avoiding blowing themselves up. The Spaniards were surprised at being fired at and left hurriedly. The only source of drinking water on Bermuda was rainwater, which the settlers collected in shallow pools, and later, as shown here, from their roofs using the local limestone. So this is a pipe from the roof to the water tank. And this is the old chapel. The settlers distrusted the local produce, so lived on barrels of salted fish, and many died of vitamin deficiency. Governor Moore used the lure of rare ambergris found on the shore to get further food and supplies from England. Some of the Virginia Company shareholders had meanwhile actually purchased Bermuda for £2,000 and were upset that they weren't getting more ambergris. So Governor Moore had to return to England to defend himself. Governor Tucker replaced Moore. Eventually, the settlers learnt to plant tobacco, corn, wheat, beans, and melons, and coins were minted, called hog money, as they had a picture of a wild hog, the only mammals on the island. So you can see the wild hog there. And for the Sea Venture. Whaling became important to the economy after a specially fitted ship was sent from England. This is modern whaling, whale watching, which has replaced whaling, as the whales all go past Bermuda a certain time of year. Life was a struggle economically for the first settlers, and many helped the privateers or became pirates themselves. In 1678, Bermudians discovered the Turks Islands near the Bahamas and started the important salt trade from there for the preservation of food. In 1616, a black slave was brought in who had experience in growing tobacco, but it couldn't match that grown in Virginia. Then in 1619, the governor was presented with some West Indian slaves off a boat. Next came 32 captured Native American women, then called Red Indians, as slaves from the English colonies in North America, followed by more. There was little need for them in the fields, so they became servants in the houses. One observer reported, "There was no manner of work to employ them advantageously, but the inhabitants have a pride in keeping of them. No slaves in the West Indies are used so well. They made good and trustworthy crewmen on the sailing ships and became skilled in the building trades." This map shows the various settlements. So you can see the Europeans from 1560s going to America and then coming down to Bermuda in 1609, the English. Then Africans going up in 1400s to Spain and then over to West Indies. Africans and Indians, or Native Americans, as now called, and Africans in the 17th, 18th century, and then the Native Americans coming from the 17th century, and the Portuguese from 1849 and in 1923 for agriculture and tourism from Madeira and the Azores. In Cromwell's time, 50 Irishmen were sent as slaves to Bermuda, but proved unruly. Slavery was finally abolished in 1834. In 1615, the Somers Island Company took over Bermuda under a new charter with a new governor and more settlers. St. George became the capital of Bermuda, named for Sir George Somers. First Parliament was held in 1620 at St. Peter's Church in St. George, with a General Assembly making local laws. Bridges were built between the main islands, together with a fort and church. St. George still has a ducking stool and stocks in the town square, and the old courthouse. As you see the inside of the old courthouse, the town hall and courthouse in St. George's. And this is actually the stocks here in the corner on the left. The ducking sewers down on the harbour. Governor Henry Hamilton began the building of Hamilton in 1792, including the Cathedral, Government House and City Hall, and moved the capital there from St. George on the 1st of January 1815. It was nearer the centre of Bermuda and had a better harbour. City Hall is now home to the National Art Gallery. After the Civil War in England, Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans came to power, beheading King Charles I. Bermudians were predominantly loyalist and so protested to Charles II, their king. This led Governor William Sale and other Puritans to leave, and they settled the Bahamas. Cromwell's Parliament, however, declared in 1650 that Bermuda was in a state of rebellion, forbade any trade with the colony. Bermuda had to back down and acknowledge Cromwell's Commonwealth, finding itself with a new Puritan governor, but they celebrated when Charles II became king in 1660. In 1684, the Bermuda Company was wound up, and Bermuda became a colony under the British Crown. In 1775, during the American War of Independence, American ships arrived to take Bermuda, but the Royal Navy had got there the day before, so they had to leave. Bermuda remained British. However, gunpowder from the gunpowder magazine behind St. George's at Tobacco Bay, which is shown here in this picture, was shipped secretly to the Americans, and General George Washington wrote them a letter of thanks. In 1812, during the Napoleonic Wars, when America was supporting the French against the British, Bermuda successfully helped to blockade the American ports. And in 1813, there was a successful attack by Bermudian ships on Washington, and the White House was burnt down, but Baltimore held out. In 1826, the Duke of Wellington devised a scheme of fortification for Bermuda, which is still there today. As a result, the Royal Navy built massive fortifications on Ireland Island, and a large house was built in the 1820s for the Commissioner of the Dockyard, which you can see in this picture. The Commissioner came in the same year as the first British convicts were brought to Bermuda, transportation instead of death, as they did, or to Australia. They were housed below decks in old ships moored off the dockyard. Conditions were bad. In 1863, when the convict transportation system ended, all who survived returned to England, except one who opted to stay. Imagine they all have family in England or other interests. From 1861 to 1865, there was civil war in America. Bermudian ships proved good at relieving the blockade of the South, making fortunes from taking cotton to the mills in Britain. In 1901, the Boer War caused the British to send some 430 Boer prisoners to be guarded on some of Bermuda's islands. They were well looked after and sold their cedar wood carvings, which are still prized today. After American independence, Britain had set up a naval base on Bermuda, which was further fortified in the First World War and remained until after the Second World War. The Americans also set up a base in 1918 and two bases in 1941 and built the airport on St. David's Island between 1941 and 43, which we can see in this picture. And this is the causeway that goes across to the airport. In 1959, NASA set up a tracking station which still monitors space launches. In the 19th century, Bermuda was supplying spring vegetables to America using Portuguese workers from Madeira and the Azores. But refrigeration of American railroad boxcars meant Bermuda's vegetables were no longer needed. So this is vegetable growing in Bermuda, a somewhat amusing picture since it includes my sister's grandchild in what she assumes is the right costume in which to pick pumpkins. From this Elsa, Princess Elsa from the film Frozen, is who she's dressed at, as her granny made the cloak. So I just put that in for amusement, really. Tourism had brought Americans to Bermuda, boosted by prohibition in the 1920s. More hotels and golf courses were built, and cruise liners visited Hamilton. You can see the size of these cruise liners. They now mostly go to Dockyard at the other end of the island, because they're so big now. The tourist trade came to rescue Bermuda, and as a tax haven, it attracted offshore companies. Its banking and insurance industries also enabled Bermuda to prosper in the 20th century. I thought this was a nice picture, and presumably the sand could be regarded as a hazard, but there are a lot of golf courses on Bermuda. The colourful Gombe dancers and singers have performed in Bermuda since the mid-17th century and do so for tourists today. At first called canoe dancers, they combine many different influences from Africa, the West Indies, Britain, and Native America. This is an old picture, and then a more modern picture. As you can see, they are extremely colourful with these enormously long headdresses. The railway used to run across Bermuda and along Front Street in Hamilton, as shown here in this picture, black and white picture. And then we see on the other side Hamilton today. The old railway line has now become a trail used by walkers and cyclists. Rather recognisable for walkers and cyclists from here. My sister's grandchildren again, but you can get an idea of the paths where the old railway line went. In 1965, the Bermuda property requirement of £60 to be allowed to vote was removed and every adult given the right to vote. The British government surrendered its power to veto laws passed by the Bermuda legislature, only overseeing foreign affairs and internal and external security. Bermuda's population is now over 60,000. This is a picture of St. George today. And here we have Flats Inlet, which is across from the causeway. The causeway lies beyond here. Bermuda has an aquarium at Flats Inlet, but in the seas around the island, you can spot turtles, rays, and colourful tropical fish in the clear water. So the aquarium is here. And we'll now see some pictures. So this is the Bermudiana flowers, which are native to Bermuda. This is the little tree frogs, which makes a bell-like sound at night. This is my not so good picture of a parrotfish, but you can get an idea of its turquoisey colour. This is a long-tail bird. There are lots of those in Bermuda. And this is a kiskadee, which makes a sound like kiskadee, which there are also a lot of in Bermuda. The fine pink sands of Bermuda continue to attract tourists to its lovely beaches and warm, clear waters. The strange stories of the Bermuda Triangle remain a mystery and are not believed by Bermudians. This is a couple of more pictures of Horseshoe Bay. I think you can see Princess Elsa there. And this is looking in the two different directions at Horseshoe Bay. This is dog exercise. That shows you also the different kinds of scenery. This is a little beach. And this is a nice quiet bay. Achilles Bay. And here is sunset, the end of my talk.